Why would a wealthy cowboy who doubted his new bride suddenly ask her to stay forever after one quiet dinner? The spoon struck Colton Hayes' plate with a sharp clink. Wind scraped snow against the ranch windows as Eliza set fresh sourdough bread beside him. Colton tasted it, stared across the steaming table, and lowered his voice. What had he finally seen in the woman he'd doubted? "Stay with us and tell me what you think." The contract landed on Gerald Whitmore's desk with a dry slap. Eliza Mercer did not touch it. Outside the office door, the Grand Monarch Hotel kitchen was already awake. Pans struck iron ranges. A delivery boy rolled a flour barrel across the service floor. Someone called for more coffee in the dining room. For 5 years, those sounds had marked the beginning of Eliza's day. That morning, they sounded like goodbye. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. "You understand what happens if you refuse?" Eliza looked at the paper again. The new contract cut her authority in the kitchen while holding her responsible for its performance. A male supervisor would be placed above her. Her wages would be reduced. Worse, the restrictions followed her after resignation, limiting where she could work and what former employees she could hire. Whitmore had managed to put a cage into legal language. "I understand what you've written." His expression hardened. "You walk out of the Grand Monarch, Mercer, and every respectable hotel between here and New York will hear why." Eliza had spent 5 years turning his kitchen from a disorderly collection of cooks into one of the hotel's proudest operations. She had trained workers, negotiated with suppliers, reduced waste, and learned which customers wanted breakfast before the city was properly awake. Now Whitmore wanted the work without the woman who had built it. Eliza removed her apron. She folded it once, then again. She laid it beside the contract. "I won't sign." For the first time, Gerald Whitmore seemed uncertain. Only for a second. Then he smiled. "You'll regret that." Eliza picked up her coat. Perhaps she would. But regret was different from surrender. By evening, everything she still owned fit into a worn travel bag. $42.30. 2 dresses suitable for travel. 1 better dress wrapped carefully in paper. Her kitchen notebook, a comb, a small photograph, several letters tied with string, and a crock containing the sourdough starter she had kept alive for 6 years. She carried all of it west. 3 weeks later, on an October afternoon in 1879, Eliza stepped down from a stagecoach into Harland Crossing, Wyoming territory. Cold struck her first. Not Chicago cold. This wind had room to gather speed. It came across open country smelling of dust, horse sweat, dry grass, and snow that had not fallen yet. Eliza steadied her hat and looked along the street. A mercantile stood opposite the stage office. Beyond it were a blacksmith shop, a feed store, a narrow hotel, and several false front buildings with hitching rails crowded by horses. Wagons had cut deep ruts through the hardened mud. No Colton Hayes. Eliza waited while the driver unloaded a crate. Then a young man in a brown coat came hurrying across the street. "Miss Mercer?" "Yes." He stopped in front of her and pulled off his hat. "Decker. Hayes Ranch." Eliza glanced behind him. Decker noticed. Mr. Hayes couldn't come. There was something in the young man's pause that bothered her more than the explanation. "Couldn't?" "North pasture trouble." "I see." Decker reached for her bag. Eliza kept hold of it. "I can carry it." His hand dropped. "Yes, ma'am." The ranch lay nearly an hour outside Harland Crossing. The farther they traveled, the smaller civilization became. Cottonwoods followed a creek through tawny grass. Low mountains stood blue-gray against the western horizon. Cattle moved behind wire and split-rail fencing, dark shapes under a sky that seemed too large for any roof to matter. Decker tried conversation twice. Both attempts died quickly. Finally, Eliza asked, "Has Mr. Hayes changed his mind?" The reins creaked in Decker's hands. "About what?" "About me." Decker stared ahead. "He doesn't change his mind easy." "That wasn't my question." The young man swallowed. "No, ma'am." It was not quite an answer. Hayes Ranch appeared beyond a rise. The house was larger than Eliza expected. 2 stories of weathered timber with a broad porch facing south. Barns and corrals spread behind it. Beyond them were bunkhouses, sheds, haystacks, cattle pens, and open range stretching toward the mountains. This was wealth in Wyoming. Not chandeliers. Land, cattle, men, winter stores, the ability to lose something and still have something left. Eliza climbed down before Decker could circle the wagon. She carried her own bag inside. A broad-shouldered woman with gray beginning at her temples stood in the kitchen beside a black iron stove. She looked at Eliza, then at the bag, then at Decker. "You, Martha?" Eliza asked. "I am. I'm Eliza Mercer." "I know who you are." Martha wiped her hands on her apron. "I've cooked in this house 11 years. There was no welcome in the statement. Eliza set her bag beside a chair. "Then I expect you know things about feeding this ranch that I don't." Martha's eyes narrowed. "I won't be pushed out of my kitchen. I didn't come here to push you anywhere. You're his bride. If I become his wife, I'll still need to know which supplier cheats on coffee weight and which shelf freezes first in January." Martha said nothing. Eliza removed her gloves. 11 years is a long time to learn a place. I'd rather borrow what you know than spend 11 more learning it badly." Something changed in Martha's face. Not friendliness. Not yet. But the door had opened half an inch. Colton Hayes rode in shortly before supper. Eliza heard him before she saw him. Hooves crossed the yard. A man's voice gave instructions near the barn. Boots struck the porch. Then the kitchen doorway filled. Colton was taller than she had imagined from his letters. His coat carried dust along one shoulder. His boots were muddy, and several days of beard shadow darkened his jaw. He looked like a man who had spent more hours in saddles than parlors. He removed his hat. "Miss Mercer, Mr. Hayes." For several seconds, neither moved. His letters had been practical. He owned Hayes Ranch. He was 38. He wanted a wife willing to live far from a city. He did not promise luxury, though Eliza had already discovered his definition of luxury was considerably stricter than most people's. She had answered with equal practicality. She could cook, manage accounts, supervise stores, sew adequately, and did not frighten easily. Nothing in their correspondence had prepared either of them for standing 6 feet apart in a Wyoming kitchen. Colton looked at her travel-worn dress, then toward the window where the first thin ice of evening had begun forming in the water trough. Eliza understood the thought. Chicago woman. Wyoming winter. He was wondering if he had made a mistake. Supper did little to settle matters. Martha had prepared the beef. Eliza finished the gravy, corrected the potatoes, and baked biscuits from the starter she had carried west. Colton ate quietly. Finally, Eliza asked, "Well?" He looked up. "The meal, yes." He considered it with irritating seriousness. "Reasonable." Martha turned toward the stove so quickly, Eliza suspected she was hiding a smile. Eliza folded her napkin. High praise. Colton's eyes met hers. For one brief moment, something almost amused moved through them. Then it disappeared. Before dawn the next morning, he found Eliza in the kitchen. A lamp burned beside her notebook. Flour dusted the table. The sourdough crock sat near the stove. Colton stopped. "You're up early." "So are you." "Cattle don't care what time it is. Neither does bread." She handed him a warm biscuit. He broke it open. Steam rose between his fingers. He took one bite, then another. "What did you put in this?" "Nothing unusual. This isn't yesterday's biscuit." The starter had traveled 3 weeks yesterday. He looked toward the crock. "You brought that from Chicago?" "I've kept it 6 years." Colton took another bite. "Leave it." Eliza looked at him. "The starter? The biscuit?" He sat down. It was the first thing he had asked her for that did not sound like an evaluation. Later that morning, he made the mistake of showing her his household accounts. By noon, Eliza had inspected the dry stores. By 1, the root cellar. At 2, she was checking sacks, barrels, dates, lids, and spoiled corners. Colton found her kneeling beside a bin of beans. "What is it?" Eliza stood. "You have no reliable inventory. We know what's here." "No. You remember what you think is here." His jaw tightened. She opened her notebook. 2 salt barrels aren't sealed properly. 3 bean sacks have moisture damage. Your flour rotation is backward. Dried fruit was ordered without comparing what remained from spring, and nobody appears to be tracking household consumption against the number of hands you're feeding. We got through last winter. Barely. Colton's expression changed. "Not on my ranch." Eliza held his gaze. "It happened on your ranch." Silence filled the storeroom. She handed him 4 pages. 3 winter supply plans. Lean, moderate, expensive. Colton read every line. Eliza waited. At last he tapped the middle plan. This one. That afternoon, he sent her back to Harland Crossing with Decker to place the revised orders. At Greer's Mercantile, the storekeeper studied Eliza over his spectacles before filling out the receipt. "So you're Hayes' mail-order bride." Eliza placed the supply list on his counter. "Today I'm the woman ordering 60 pounds of beans." Greer coughed into his fist. Behind her, a woman introduced as Ruth Calloway smiled politely. "Wyoming winters can be difficult for people who haven't seen one, so I've been told." "You planning to stay?" Eliza looked at her. "That seems to be a popular question." Outside, Decker loaded flour into the wagon. 2 ranch hands stood near the hitching rail. One of them laughed when Eliza passed. She caught only part of the sentence. "Briggs says Christmas." Eliza stopped. Decker suddenly became very interested in tightening a rope. "Decker." He froze. "What happens at Christmas?" "Nothing." "Tom Briggs." Decker sighed. "They've got a pool." "A pool." "Betting." Eliza looked toward the 2 men. "On what?" Decker's ears reddened. "When you'll leave." The street seemed quieter than it had a moment earlier. Wind pushed dust along the boardwalk. Eliza looked down at the receipt in her hand, then toward the western road leading back to Hayes Ranch. Chicago was more than 1,000 miles behind her. Gerald Whitmore had promised to make sure respectable people knew why she had left. Here, men who barely knew her were already wagering on when she would run. And somewhere beyond the distant ridge, Colton Hayes was still deciding whether they were wrong. Eliza folded the receipt carefully. "Load the salt under the canvas," she said. Decker blinked. "Ma'am? Snow ruins salt. And if Mr. Briggs put money on Christmas, I'd hate to make it easy for him." She climbed into the wagon. Then she picked up the reins. For the first mile out of Harland Crossing, Decker said nothing. The wagon groaned beneath flour, beans, salt, coffee, dried apples, lamp oil, and the other supplies Eliza had ordered against Colton's middle-cost plan. Wind moved through the yellow grass beside the road. Far ahead, the mountains had disappeared behind a bank of gray cloud. Finally, Decker cleared his throat. "Briggs isn't a bad man." Eliza kept her eyes on the road. "I didn't ask if he was. He's been with Mr. Hayes a long while. That doesn't make him good at gambling." Decker looked sideways at her. Eliza gave him nothing more. By the time they reached Hayes Ranch, the matter had been put where she intended to keep it. Behind her. There was too much work ahead to spend winter proving herself to men one argument at a time. The new supplies arrived over the next 4 days. Eliza numbered shelves in the dry store, moved older sacks forward, marked dates in charcoal, and started a weekly count in her notebook. Martha watched the first day from the doorway with her arms folded. On the second day, she stepped inside. "You put potatoes there. They'll freeze come January." Eliza looked toward the wall. "Where do you keep them?" "Lower shelf, east side." Eliza moved them. On the third morning, Martha set a cup of coffee beside Eliza's notebook without saying a word. Eliza drank it before it went cold. That was how peace began between them. Not with an apology, with coffee. The first trouble came over flour. Eliza counted every Monday and Thursday. On Thursday morning, 45 pounds were missing from Pete's cookhouse allocation. She counted again. Same answer. She checked Martha's kitchen, the bunkhouse stores, the receiving sheet, then Greer's invoice. Nothing. At supper, Eliza watched the men through the kitchen doorway. Tom Briggs ate with the easy appetite of someone who believed himself invisible. Decker did not. The young hand barely touched his potatoes. Afterward, Eliza found him beside the pump. "Who took the flour?" His face fell. "Miss Mercer." "Who?" Decker stared at the frozen mud between his boots. "Briggs and another fellow." "Why?" "They wanted to see how long before your numbers stopped matching." Eliza almost laughed. Instead, she looked toward the bunkhouse. "Does Mr. Hayes know?" "No, ma'am. Good." Decker blinked. "You're not telling him? If 45 pounds of flour requires the owner of Hayes Ranch to rescue me, Mr. Briggs has already won." The flour reappeared 2 nights later. No confession came with it. Eliza simply entered the corrected amount in her notebook and turned the page. A week afterward, several ranch wives gathered at the Calloway place to sew winter shirts and exchange preserves. Eliza went with Martha. Dorothy Briggs was pleasant enough to make every sentence difficult to challenge. "I suppose Chicago women find our winters rather primitive." Eliza threaded a needle. "I suppose Wyoming women find Chicago kitchens rather crowded." Clara Hendricks smiled. Dorothy did not. Later, Clara asked, "Martha's been at Hayes 11 years, hasn't she? 3 housekeepers came and went in that time. What makes you think you'll succeed?" The room became quiet. Eliza glanced toward Martha, who was sorting buttons at the far end of the table. "I don't intend to defeat Martha." Martha's hands stopped. Eliza continued sewing. Any woman foolish enough to throw away 11 years of knowledge deserves whatever happens afterward. Martha looked down at the buttons again, but on the ride home she handed Eliza the thicker lap blanket without being asked. The men changed more slowly. Ruiz changed first. He appeared at the kitchen door one afternoon with his left hand wrapped in a barn rag. Eliza smelled the wound before she finished untying the cloth. "How long?" "Couple days." Martha leaned over. "Fool man." Ruiz looked offended. Eliza cleaned the cut, wrapped it properly, and told him to keep manure, saddle grease, and filthy rags away from it. "Yes, ma'am. And if it worsens, you tell us." "Yes, ma'am, 3 days later, Ruiz touched 2 fingers to his hat when Eliza crossed the yard. The next day, another hand did the same. Tom Briggs did not. He cornered her beside the storehouse after seeing the revised flour order. "You've been here 3 weeks. 24 days. That's my point. You can't learn cattle country in 24 days. Eliza closed the ledger. "I'm not trying to teach you cattle. You're telling us how much flour we need." "No, I'm telling you £45 disappeared. Briggs's face tightened. That's not ranching. Eliza tucked the pencil behind her ear. Exactly. That's counting. From the barn doorway, Decker coughed violently into his sleeve. Briggs walked away. That evening, Colton asked to see the accounts. He stood beside Eliza at the kitchen table while she explained them. His sleeve brushed the edge of her notebook once, and he moved back as if the contact had surprised him. You've done this before. Eliza kept writing. Yes. Where? She hesitated. The Grand Monarch. Colton waited. I managed the kitchen. His brows lifted. The whole kitchen? For 5 years. Martha said that hotel feeds hundreds, on busy days. Why would someone running a place like that answer a matrimonial advertisement in Wyoming? The pencil stopped. Eliza could hear the stove ticking as the iron cooled. She looked at him. That wasn't part of your question. Colton's expression changed almost imperceptibly. No. He did not ask again. The restraint stayed with her longer than the question. After that, Colton began appearing in the kitchen earlier. Sometimes he wanted inventory figures. Sometimes Pete had supposedly asked about coffee. Sometimes there was no reason Eliza could identify at all. She began recognizing his boots in the hall. He began noticing when her coffee sat untouched. And when she baked sourdough, the darker crust somehow found its way onto his plate. Martha noticed. Martha noticed everything. She said nothing. Then, during the second week of November, Wyoming stopped giving them time for small things. Snow began after midnight. By dawn, 14 inches covered Hayes Ranch. The corrals vanished beneath white drifts. Fence posts became black marks in the storm. Wind drove snow sideways against the windows so hard that Eliza could barely see the barn from the kitchen. At 5 a.m, the back door opened. Colton came in coated from hat to boots. Lower herd's in trouble. Eliza set down the coffee pot. What do you need from the house? He looked at her. Perhaps he had expected questions. Perhaps fear. Hot food that can travel. Coffee. As much as we can carry. When? 20 minutes. Eliza turned toward Martha. Neither woman needed another word. The kitchen changed instantly. Biscuits went into cloth-lined baskets. Beef was sliced. Coffee filled every available tin container. Martha wrapped potatoes in towels. Eliza recalculated what could leave the pantry without weakening the week's ration. For 5 days, the storm controlled the clocks. Men rode out before daylight and returned after dark with ice on their coats. Eliza kept food moving, counted supplies each night, shifted portions where necessary, and sent Decker to the Hendricks place with the pump repair kit she had found and inventoried weeks earlier. On the 5th morning, pounding shook the kitchen door. 2 young hands stood outside. Between them lay a newborn calf, nearly motionless. Bring her in. One stared at Eliza. In the kitchen? Unless you've found somewhere warmer. They carried the calf inside. Mud streaked the floor. Martha entered from the pantry, took one look, and did not complain. Blankets, she said. They worked beside the stove. Eliza rubbed the calf while Martha warmed cloths and muttered that any creature foolish enough to be born in weather like this had better learn gratitude. Minutes passed. Then the calf moved. A weak leg stretched. Martha stopped. Again. The little animal struggled. This time its head lifted. By 7:30, the kitchen door opened. Colton stepped inside. He was exhausted, unshaven, his coat wet with melting snow. Then he stopped. Eliza and Martha were sitting on the floor. Mud covered Eliza's skirt. Her hair had come loose near one temple. Beside the stove, the calf stood on trembling legs. Eliza looked up at Colton. She'll make it." For several seconds, he said nothing. His eyes moved from the calf to Martha, then back to Eliza. The woman he had expected to endure Wyoming had spent 5 days helping hold his ranch together, while the country outside tried to freeze it apart. "Good work," he said. Only 2 words. But he did not look away. Neither did Eliza. Across the room, Martha slowly picked up the coffee pot. She had lived in that house 11 years. She knew the difference between gratitude and the moment a man realized he had something to lose. Outside, snow kept falling. The roads were still buried. Neighboring ranches were already cutting deeper into their winter stores. And Colton Hayes was no longer wondering whether his new bride would survive until Christmas. He was beginning to wonder what Hayes Ranch would become if she ever left. The roads opened 8 days after the storm began. Not completely. Wagon wheels still sank into soft drifts along the Harland Crossing Road, and shaded cuts held snow nearly to a horse's belly. But the sky cleared hard and blue, and smoke began rising again from ranch houses across the valley. Hayes Ranch looked battered. 1 shed roof had sagged. 2 fence lines needed repair. Men moved with the slow stiffness of people who had slept too little. But the cattle had been managed. The hands had been fed. The house had never gone short. And when Eliza counted the pantry on the first clear morning, the October reserves remained almost exactly where her projections said they should be. That evening, Colton returned after dark. He stamped snow from his boots and entered the kitchen expecting to find ledgers, men, or another problem waiting. Instead, he found supper: beef stew, roasted carrots and turnips, coffee, a loaf of sourdough bread cooling beneath a clean cloth. Martha had already gone to her room. For once, nobody needed anything. Eliza sat across from Colton at the kitchen table. He ate slowly. The lamp threw warm light over the boards. Wind touched the windows, but it no longer sounded threatening. Somewhere beyond the house, a horse knocked against a stall wall. Colton tore another piece from the loaf. Eliza noticed. "You've eaten half of that." "I've been outside 8 days." "That explains hunger, not greed." The corner of his mouth moved. Then he looked around the kitchen. The shelves were full. His gloves were drying near the stove. His coffee was hot. Eliza's notebook rested closed instead of open between them. Colton had owned this house for years. He had paid for the lumber, paid for the roof, paid the men who repaired it. Until that night, he had never understood that owning a house and coming home were not the same thing. His eyes returned to Eliza. "Please stay forever." Her hand stopped beside her cup. The room became very still. Colton seemed surprised by his own words. Eliza looked down at the table. Chicago came back to her in one ugly instant. Whitmore's office, the contract, the folded apron, a man telling her that what she had built belonged to him because he owned the walls around it. She wanted Colton's words to mean something different. That was precisely why she could not accept them yet. "Don't ask me that because you need your ranch managed." Colton's expression tightened. "I didn't say, I know what you said." She looked at him. Her voice was gentle now. "I also know what happens when a man's gratitude for a woman's work becomes confused with what he feels for the woman." The silence lasted. Colton could have defended himself. He could have reminded her that she had come west intending marriage. Instead, he lowered his eyes to the bread between them. "All right." That was all. No persuasion. No wounded pride. He finished his coffee. The restraint followed Eliza upstairs. 3 mornings later, Jim Calloway rode into the yard. His horse was blowing steam when Decker brought him to the kitchen. Jim removed his hat. "Hayes says you're the reason his stores look better than mine." Eliza glanced toward Colton. He stood near the stove. He did not take credit. He did not answer for her. Jim placed a folded sheet of figures on the table. "We're using feed faster than expected." Eliza pulled out a chair. "Sit down." By noon, she had built him a winter projection. Ruth Calloway came the following week, then Clara Hendricks. Soon, women from neighboring ranches were sitting at Eliza's kitchen table comparing flour use, dried beans, salt, corn, lamp oil, and feed reserves. Howard Morrison held out longest. He had run cattle for 20 years and did not care for new systems. Then his corn reserve dropped faster than expected. He sent Margaret Morrison with the household accounts. Margaret studied Eliza's columns for several minutes. "My husband thinks numbers become less true when he dislikes them." Eliza looked up. "I've worked for men like that." Margaret smiled. "I suspected you had." Across the room, Colton heard it. He had begun to understand something about Eliza that his matrimonial advertisement had never accounted for. He had wanted a woman who could enter his life. Eliza had entered it and changed the shape of everything around her. Then the Chicago stage came through Harland Crossing. Decker returned from town near dusk carrying the mail. One envelope bore Gerald Whitmore's handwriting. It was addressed to Colton Hayes. Colton read it alone. Then he read it again. $240. The letter claimed Eliza had taken the money from Grand Monarch operating accounts. Whitmore wrote that she had been dismissed for theft and fled Chicago before the matter could be pursued. At the bottom was one final sentence. Copies had been sent to Jim Calloway and Howard Morrison. Colton carried the letter into the kitchen. Eliza knew the handwriting before she saw the signature. Her face lost its color. Colton placed the paper on the table. She read it. Once. Her fingers tightened around the edge. "So." The word came quietly. Colton pulled out the chair opposite her. "Tell me what happened." Eliza looked up. "Not, is this true? Not, what did you do? Tell me what happened." For several seconds she could not speak. Then she sat. 5 years. Colton waited. "I gave that hotel 5 years." She told him about the staff she trained, the waste she cut, the suppliers she negotiated with, the kitchen Whitmore praised whenever wealthy guests praised him. Then she told him about the contract, the reduced salary, the male supervisor Whitmore intended to put above her, the restrictions that would follow her if she left, and the threat. He said respectable hotels would hear why I was gone. Colton's jaw shifted. "Did you take the money?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "Why didn't you tell me all of this before?" Eliza looked toward the dark window. "Because I didn't know you. You came here to marry me. I came here to see whether I could." That struck him silent. Eliza folded Whitmore's letter. "I needed to know whether this was somewhere I could tell the truth without having it used to close the door behind me." Colton rose. For one terrible moment, Eliza thought the conversation was finished. Instead, he went to the desk in the adjoining room. He returned carrying 3 letters. He placed them in front of her. Chicago postmarks. Eliza stared at them. "What are these?" Replies. "To what?" "Questions I asked 2 weeks ago." Her eyes lifted sharply. Colton sat again. "After you told me you managed the Grand Monarch, I wrote to suppliers in Chicago." Eliza did not move. "You investigated me. I checked what didn't make sense, without asking me." "Yes." There was no excuse in his voice, only fact. "I knew a woman who could do what you've done here didn't leave one of Chicago's better hotels with $42 unless there was more to the story." Eliza opened the first letter. A produce supplier confirmed that the Grand Monarch kitchen had expanded under her management. The second described Whitmore as difficult in contracts and slow to give credit. The third stated plainly that kitchen quality had declined after Eliza left and that her departure followed a dispute over employment terms. Eliza lowered the page. "Why didn't you confront me?" Colton looked at Whitmore's accusation. "Because I wanted facts before somebody else's accusation became yours." The kitchen clock ticked. Eliza had spent weeks preparing herself for the moment her past caught the stage west. She had imagined suspicion, distance, perhaps another bag packed before dawn. She had not imagined this. A man who doubted her when she arrived had quietly made certain that when someone finally tried to destroy her name, doubt would not be the only thing waiting. "You believed me before I explained." Colton shook his head slightly. "I believed what I'd seen." Something tightened behind Eliza's ribs. She looked down before he could see too much. Then Colton touched another envelope on the table. "There's a problem." Eliza looked up. "Whitmore sent copies." "I know. Calloway came by the Mercantile before Decker left town. Morrison too." Eliza understood. Harland Crossing carried news faster than any stage. "Dorothy?" Colton nodded. "Briggs was in town." Eliza leaned back. The next gathering of the ranch wives was in 3 days. Whitmore had failed to keep her in Chicago. Now he was reaching across 4 states to decide what Wyoming would think of her. Colton gathered the letters. "I can go with you." Eliza looked at him. "To the gathering?" "No." His eyes narrowed. "No. If I need the owner of Hayes Ranch standing beside me every time someone questions my name, then my name still isn't mine." Colton studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right." Again, no argument. Eliza reached for the sourdough crock beside the stove. She removed the cloth and fed the starter with practiced hands. Flour, water, a wooden spoon. The same small living thing she had carried from Chicago when nearly everything else had been taken from her. Colton watched her. "You always do that when you're worried?" Eliza kept stirring. "Bread doesn't care about rumors." "That so?" "It cares whether you feed it." He looked at the crock, then at her. "Seems reasonable." Eliza stopped stirring. She slowly raised her eyes. The first supper, his first judgment. Reasonable. For the first time since Whitmore's letter arrived, she smiled. Only a little. Colton saw it. Neither mentioned his words from the night after the storm. "Please stay forever." They remained between them anyway. But 3 days from now, Eliza would walk into Harland Crossing knowing Gerald Whitmore's accusation had arrived before her. And this time, she would not run west. The morning of the gathering came cold and bright. Martha drove. Neither woman spoke much during the ride. Snow lay in shallow folds along the road, hardened by wind. The wagon runners scraped frozen ruts, and every few miles Martha clicked her tongue at the horses, as though silence itself needed moving along. The gathering was at Ruth Calloway's house. By the time Eliza removed her coat, she knew. Dorothy Briggs was pouring coffee. Clara Hendricks sat beside the stove. Ruth was arranging sewing baskets. Conversation continued when Eliza entered, but not quite naturally. Dorothy waited until everyone had settled. Then she folded a piece of cloth in her lap. "I hate repeating unpleasant things." Martha's needle stopped. Eliza kept hers moving. Dorothy continued. "But when something concerns people we know, silence can be worse." She mentioned Gerald Whitmore, the Grand Monarch, $240. She never called Eliza a thief. That was the clever part. She merely wondered why an innocent woman would travel so far without explaining why she had left a respected position. When Dorothy finished, Eliza tied off her thread. "Are you asking me?" Dorothy blinked. "I think everyone deserves clarity." "All right." Eliza placed the sewing in her lap. Then she gave them clarity. She told them about 5 years of managing the Grand Monarch kitchen, the staff she trained, the suppliers she dealt with, the improvements Whitmore accepted gladly while her name remained mostly invisible. Then she described the contract. Lower wages, a supervisor placed above her, restrictions after resignation, the threat to ruin her prospects if she refused. "Mr. Whitmore's letter tells you I left," Eliza said. "It does not tell you what he wanted me to sign before I did." Dorothy shifted. "But the missing money was not missing because of me." Clara Hendricks set down her cup. "My mother was blacklisted once." Everyone turned. Clara's voice remained calm. "Ohio, dry goods store. She asked why a man doing the same work was being paid more. The owner told 3 other merchants she was troublesome." Dorothy opened her mouth. Ruth Calloway stood. "Clara, did you bring that apple preserve recipe?" The change was almost comically ordinary. Clara nodded. "In my basket. I want it before I forget." Within moments, Ruth was asking Martha about nutmeg. Margaret Morrison was discussing flour storage, and the room simply moved on. Nobody applauded Eliza. Nobody delivered a speech. Dorothy Briggs was left sitting with Whitmore's story, and no audience willing to carry it for her. Eliza preferred it that way. 2 evenings later, Tom Briggs came to the Hayes kitchen alone. He stood outside until Martha opened the door. His hat was in his hands. Eliza looked up from her ledger. Briggs cleared his throat. The beans weren't oversalted. Eliza stared at him. Martha turned slowly from the stove. Briggs looked miserable. "What?" "The first week you were here. I told Decker the beans were oversalted." Eliza waited. "They weren't." "All right. And the flour?" "I know about the flour." His eyes lifted. "You knew 45 pounds. Martha made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Briggs rubbed the brim of his hat. "I've worked cattle since I was 14. I got used to being the fellow who knew things." Eliza closed the ledger. "And then I knew something you didn't. More than one thing." That admission cost him. She could see it. Briggs looked toward the floor. "The bet was foolish, yes. I suppose I owe you an apology." "Yes." He almost smiled. Then he became serious. "You going to be here come spring?" Eliza thought about the question. Months earlier, it had sounded like a challenge. Now it sounded almost like hope. "I plan to be." Briggs nodded. He put on his hat and left. Winter settled deeper after that. Nothing dramatic happened for several weeks. That became important. Martha made coffee. Colton ate Eliza's bread. Pete began using her numbers when he planned feed. Foster recovered from the fever that had kept him indoors for several days. Decker stopped bringing reports about who thought Eliza would leave because fewer people seemed interested in discussing it. Each morning, Eliza fed the sourdough starter. Each night, frost climbed the windows, and somewhere in those ordinary days, she stopped measuring Wyoming by how long she had endured it. She was simply living there. On January 2nd, 1880, Colton entered the kitchen carrying a folded document. Eliza was checking the December account sheets. He set the paper beside her hand. "Read this." She glanced at him. "That's an alarming way to begin a conversation." "Read it." She unfolded the document. Territorial language filled the first half of the page. property boundaries, water access, grazing acreage, structures, livestock interests. Then she found the name, Eliza Ann Mercer. Her eyes moved backward. She read the paragraph again. Colton. He stood across the table. What is this? Half of what? The ranch. She stared at him. Hayes Ranch was not a house and several cattle. It was thousands of acres, water rights, barns, herds, equipment, and years of accumulated wealth. You cannot be serious. I am. Why? Colton pulled out the chair opposite her. I started preparing it after the storm. That doesn't answer me. No. He looked toward out the window. Then I started thinking about March. What about March? I couldn't picture it without you. The words were quieter than his first request. Please stay forever. Eliza looked down at the deed. Why didn't you just ask me to marry you? Colton's eyes returned to hers. Because marriage would give you a place here that depended on me. Eliza said nothing. I want you to have a place that's yours whether you choose me or not. For a moment, she was back in Whitmore's office. Another document, another man. But Whitmore's paper had been designed to remove every safe direction except toward him. Colton's document did the opposite. It gave her a road away. Eliza folded the deed. I need time. You have it. She carried the paper upstairs. For 5 days, it remained beside the sourdough crock in her room. Colton never asked. On the 4th evening, Eliza found Martha alone in the pantry. If you had helped build something for 11 years, Eliza asked, would you want your name on it? Martha looked around. Shelves, jars, flour bins, the stove beyond the doorway. If Colton sold this place tomorrow, I'd leave with my wages and whatever fit in a trunk. She wiped her hands on her apron. So yes. Friday morning, Eliza read every line of the deed again. Then she carried it downstairs. Colton was waiting at the kitchen table with Decker. The young ranch hand looked terrified by the responsibility of witnessing anything more important than a feed receipt. Eliza sat. She noticed something she had missed before. Colton's signature line was blank. You haven't signed. No. Why? Because you signed first. Her throat tightened. Not because he doubted. Because he would not make his commitment into pressure. Eliza picked up the pen. The nib scratched across the paper. Eliza Ann Mercer. Only then did Colton take the pen. He signed beside her. Decker witnessed both names. By Thursday, all Harland Crossing knew. Ruth sent preserves. Margaret Morrison sent a note. Greer reportedly told 3 customers before breakfast. Decker finally approached Eliza while she was carrying clean towels across the yard. Briggs said something. Eliza stopped. What? Decker tried not to grin. About time somebody made it official. Eliza looked toward the house. Colton stood on the porch speaking with Pete. As though he felt her attention, he glanced across the yard. Their eyes met. Neither smiled. Neither needed to. The hardest winter weeks still waited beyond January. Spring would decide whether Eliza's careful numbers had truly been wisdom or merely good fortune. But Gerald Whitmore had once placed a contract before her because he believed security was strongest when a woman had nowhere else to go. Colton Hayes had placed a deed before her because he wanted her to know she could leave. And for the first time since Chicago, Eliza's name was written on something no man could take from her simply because she refused to belong to him. February arrived, determined to test every signature on that paper. The first week brought wind from the northwest that rattled the shutters after midnight. The second brought snow that covered the lower fence rails. By the middle of the month, men had stopped talking about an early thaw. Hayes Ranch kept moving. Every morning Pete came into the kitchen before daylight with figures written in pencil on scraps of paper. Hay consumed. Corn issued. Cattle shifted. Men fed. Eliza entered the numbers into the ledger while Martha worked the stove. One morning Pete remained after handing over his sheet. "You got another pencil?" Eliza looked up. "Probably. I want you to show me this properly." He tapped her consumption columns. Not challenge, not surrender. Just a working man admitting another person knew something useful. Eliza pulled out a chair. "Sit down." For nearly an hour they went through the figures. Pete corrected her estimate for what cattle consumed during severe wind. Eliza showed him how that change affected the March reserve. Neither pretended the other knew everything. By breakfast, the system was better than either one had started with. Martha watched from the stove. "Funny," she said. "What?" "Looks familiar." Eliza understood. It was exactly how the two women had learned to share the kitchen, not by deciding who was more important, by deciding what worked. Other ranches were having a harder winter. Howard Morrison had ignored part of Margaret's revised supply plan after Christmas. By February, he was buying corn on credit from Greer. Callaway was stretched thin. Hendricks had lost cattle during one bitter night near the eastern ridge. Hayes Ranch was tired too. There was no miracle in Eliza's ledger. Men still rode into snow. Horses still needed feeding. Water troughs still froze. Martha still muttered whenever wet boots crossed her floor. But nobody went hungry. Nobody opened the last flour barrel wondering whether another existed. Nobody guessed. That was the difference. March finally brought dripping eaves. For 3 straight afternoons, the temperature rose above freezing. Snow softened around fence posts. Wagon tracks turned dark, and water began running beneath the crust in narrow silver threads. Martha carried 2 cups of coffee onto the porch. She handed one to Eliza. For a while they watched the yard. Decker was repairing a harness near the barn. Ruiz led 2 horses toward the corral. Beyond them, cattle moved slowly across exposed patches of grass. Martha blew across her coffee. 11 winters. Eliza glanced at her. "I've been here 11 winters. Everyone felt like something that happened to us." She nodded toward the ranch. "This one didn't." Eliza watched snow slide from the barn roof. "This year, we happened to it." Martha gave her a sideways look, then smiled into her cup. The final accounting came several days later. Colton worked at the dining table after supper with the ranch books open around him. Receipts from Greer sat in one stack. Pete's cattle reports sat in another. Eliza brought coffee. "How bad?" Colton did not answer immediately. Morrison lost 11. She sat opposite him. "Hendricks?" 4. "Callaway?" 2. Eliza looked toward the figures in front of him. "And us?" Colton leaned back. "Guess." 3. "No." 2. "No." 1. He shook his head. "None." Eliza thought she had misunderstood. "None?" "Not one." Her eyes dropped to the ledger. Colton followed them. Ruiz made the right decisions moving the western herd. Pete reorganized the feed crews. Every man out there earned that number. Then it's theirs. Partly. He pulled a report from the stack. November. Eliza recognized her handwriting. "You marked the lower ground as vulnerable before the first hard snow. That was an inventory report. It kept cattle off ground where they would have been trapped." He slid the page toward her. "Your work isn't only in that kitchen." Eliza touched the edge of the paper. For years she had watched meals leave swinging kitchen doors while other people received compliments in dining rooms. Work could disappear that way. Quietly. Completely. But this page had her handwriting. and the land it helped protect now carried her name. In early April, Jim Calloway rode over with another request. The county ranchers were meeting at Morrison's place. He wanted Eliza to present her winter system. No. Calloway stared. Colton, standing near the tack room door, raised one eyebrow. Eliza continued. I'm not a rancher. Colton looked toward the pasture. That's unfortunate. She frowned. Why? Because somebody put your name on half a cattle ranch. Calloway laughed. Eliza did not. Colton met her eyes. You own half a ranch that came through the hardest winter in 6 years without losing one head. He paused. I don't know whose permission you're waiting for. That settled it. 14 ranchers attended the April meeting. So did a county representative and an editor from the Harland Crossing Gazette. Eliza stood beside a long table in the Morrison house with ledgers, receipts, and handwritten charts arranged before her. Some men listened immediately. Others did not. One questioned whether inventory rotation mattered when every ranch already knew approximately what it owned. Eliza asked him how much flour remained in his house that morning. He could not answer. Another insisted experience mattered more than arithmetic. Eliza agreed. Then she showed how experience could be recorded so a ranch did not have to relearn the same lesson after every costly winter. Arms slowly uncrossed. Questions became specific. How large should the winter buffer be? How often should stores be counted? What changed when roads closed for 10 days? Eliza answered what she knew. When she did not know, she said so. Then Howard Morrison stood. The room quieted. 20 years, he said. I've run cattle 20 years. He glanced toward Margaret. Thought that meant weather couldn't teach me anything new. A few men smiled. Howard did not. I was wrong. He looked at Eliza. Mrs. Mercer planned for conditions instead of memories. Then he proposed that her method become a recommended winter preparedness standard for ranches in the county. Jim Calloway seconded it. The Gazette editor bent over his notebook. Tom Briggs sat against the wall. His arms were no longer crossed. Eliza looked toward Colton. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She knew that expression now. Weeks later, Decker came running from the road with a newspaper, Harland Crossing, Gazette. Martha came from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. Eliza opened the paper. The headline filled nearly half the column. Hayes Ranch Partner develops winter supply system adopted by county ranchers. Her name appeared in the first paragraph. Eliza Ann Mercer. She read it twice. Gerald Whitmore had promised people would remember her name for the wrong reason. He had failed. But even that was not the victory that mattered most. May brought Green back to Wyoming. One evening after supper, Eliza stood with Colton on the porch. The mountains were dark against the western sky. Cattle grazed beyond the fence, and somewhere near the barn, Decker was hammering a loose board into place. Colton rested his forearms on the railing. Eliza looked at him. Can I ask you something? You generally do. Am I still running from Chicago? He considered it. No. Neither am I. Silence. Then she asked, What were you running from when you placed that advertisement? Colton's jaw tightened slightly. For once, the man who could make decisions about cattle, land, wages, and winter stores seemed unable to find a sentence. Finally, he said, 30 years of building something with nobody to build it with. Eliza looked across the pasture. Now she understood. His first request had come after dinner in the depth of winter. Please stay forever. She had wanted to say yes, but wanting was not enough. Back then, she had arrived with $42.30. Whitmore was threatening her reputation. Her future depended on whether Hayes Ranch accepted her. She had needed shelter, needed work, needed somewhere to stand. Now half the land beneath her boots belonged to her. Her work carried her own name. The community knew what she had done. If she boarded tomorrow's stage, she would leave because she chose to. And if she remained, that choice would finally mean something. Eliza turned toward Colton. "Ask me again." He looked at her. No confusion crossed his face. Only recognition. "Please stay forever." This time Eliza reached for his hand. His fingers closed carefully around hers. "Now," she said, "I can say yes." Colton lowered his head until his forehead rested gently against hers. Neither spoke. The Wyoming evening did not need improving. That night, Eliza served dinner. Fresh sourdough bread rested between them. Martha moved through the kitchen without anyone wondering whose kitchen it was. Pete's new accounting sheets waited beside the ledger for morning. Outside, Decker crossed the yard toward the bunkhouse. Beyond him, in the spring pasture, the calf they had carried half frozen into Martha's kitchen during the storm followed its mother through new grass. Colton tore open a biscuit. Steam rose between his hands. He took a bite. Better than the first ones. Eliza looked across the table. Careful. That sounded almost like praise. The corner of his mouth moved. "Don't get used to it." Martha snorted from the stove. Later, when the lamps were low, Eliza went upstairs. She uncovered the crock on the windowsill. 6 years earlier, the sourdough starter had been only flour, water, patience, and something kept alive because she refused to let it die. She had carried it out of Chicago with almost nothing else. Across rail lines, across muddy roads, across country she had never seen, into a ranch house where nobody knew whether she belonged. Eliza fed the starter and covered it again. Then she rested one hand against the windowsill. It belonged partly to her now. Outside lay Hayes' ranch, his ranch, her ranch, their ranch. Not because a rich cowboy had rescued a desperate woman. Not because a capable woman had earned love by making herself useful. Colton had given her the security to leave. Eliza had stayed after she no longer had to. Downstairs, she heard his boots cross the floor. She smiled. Then she turned down the lamp and went to meet the life she had chosen. Maybe that was the real ending to Eliza Mercer's story. Not the newspaper headline. Not the ranch deed. Not even Colton's quiet promise beneath a Wyoming sunset. It was the fact that she stayed when she was finally free to leave. Imagine standing where Eliza once stood, with nearly everything you built behind you and only a worn bag in your hand. Imagine traveling hundreds of miles toward a man you barely know, wondering whether you're finding a home or simply another place where you'll have to prove your worth. Then imagine discovering someone who doesn't ask you to surrender your freedom in exchange for love. Colton had once doubted whether Eliza belonged in his world. In the end, he loved her enough to make certain she never had to depend on him to remain there. And maybe that's what lasting love looks like. Not possession, not obligation, not being needed so desperately that leaving becomes impossible. It's having the strength to open your hand and discovering that the person you love chooses to place theirs inside it anyway. Some of life's second chances arrive quietly, after a long winter, when we finally stop running and recognize the place, and the person, we're willing to choose. If Eliza's journey stayed with you, tell me in the comments, would you have stayed at Hayes Ranch? And if you'd like another story of frontier hearts, hard-won healing, and love found where it was least expected, you're always welcome to subscribe. There are more stories waiting down the trail.